What do you think of when you hear the phrase Memorial Day weekend? I know kids out there think that it's the beginning of summer vacation when they have that, when they hear that phrase, because it's only a few days away for a lot of them. We think of backyard barbecues and family get-togethers. In most churches, Memorial Day is not emphasized because it's not one of the holy days on the church calendar. The holy day that's on the church calendar, you can find it on the front of your bulletin. It's Trinity Sunday, the day where we lift up the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But I think that Memorial Day is a good day for us to consider what this holiday represents. For its very name calls us to remember. The ability to remember is a wonderful gift that God has given us. In a flash, we can remember and be a child again, a child who is playing in the sprinkler on a summer day. Through memory, we can fall in love again. We can remember the day that we got married. We can enjoy our children all over again. All this is possible through the blessing of memory. Memories are also very practical. If we couldn't remember that a red light means stop, then we would be in trouble. And if I couldn't remember my wedding anniversary or my wife's birthday, I'd be in really big trouble. Memory is a practical thing for us. The problem is, sometimes our memory fails us, and we forget. There is a guy named John, and he had a serious memory problem. One day, John ran into a friend of his, Bill, who he hadn't seen in a long time. And he said, "Bill, do you remember that I used to have a really bad memory?" And Bill said, "Yeah, I certainly do. You couldn't remember anything." And John said, "Well, it's not bad anymore. I went to this seminar and it taught me how to remember things. It was really great. Now I have this wonderful memory." Bill said, "That's great, John. What's the name of that seminar you went to?" And John said, "Well, just a minute." And he said, "Bill, what's the name of that flower that has the stem with the thorns on it and is red colored?" And Bill said, "That's rose." He said, "Oh yeah, that's right." And he turned to his wife and said, "Rose, what's the name of that seminar we went to a few months ago?" Memory. Remembering. There are things in life that we should always remember. And Memorial Day commemorates one of those. Memorial Day started near the end of the Civil War, and within a few years, the practice of going to grave sites and placing flowers on military graves spread throughout the North and the South, and it was being carried out by almost everyone, and they called it Decoration Day. Then after World War I, it became a national holiday that was dedicated to remembering those who had made the ultimate sacrifice for the freedoms that we enjoy. But we people tend to be forgetful, and so we need something to help jog our memory. So Memorial Day comes around every year, and it reminds us to remember those who died for our freedoms. In the Bible, we find that God has given us many similar reminders. After God destroyed the earth with a flood, he told Noah, "I establish my covenant with you. Never again will all life be cut off by the waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth." And then God stated, I have set a rainbow in the clouds, and it will be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. So every time we see a rainbow, it serves as a reminder of God's promise, a remembrance. Another memorial was erected when Joshua led the people of Israel across the Jordan River. The water stopped flowing just as the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant stepped into the water at the river's edge. They stood in the middle of the river until the people had crossed safely into the promised land. And while they were crossing, Joshua told 12 men, one from each of the 12 tribes, to go into the middle of the riverbed and select 12 large stones. They brought the stones onto the riverbank and made a monument out of them there. And in Joshua 4, 6 through 7, Joshua tells them, in the future, when your children ask you, what do these stones mean? Tell them that the flow of the river Jordan was cut off before the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. And when it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. These stones are meant to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever. There are special days and times which God helps us remember specific events. Another one of those events in the Bible is the Passover. The people of Israel had been sojourners and slaves in Egypt for over 400 years. God called Moses and said, Moses, I want you to go back to Egypt and say to the Pharaoh, let my people go so they can worship me. Moses did as God commanded. But the Pharaoh refused to listen. So to reinforce his demand, God sent plague upon plague to Egypt. And every time when the plague was at its worst, Pharaoh would say, stop the plague, and I'll let the people go worship. But after every plague, the Pharaoh would renege on his promise, and he'd continue in slavery. Finally, Moses tells the Egyptian officials, this is what the Lord says. About midnight, I will go throughout Egypt. Every firstborn son in Egypt will die. There will be loud wailing throughout Egypt, worse than there has ever been or ever will be again. Then God gave instructions to the Israelites. Each family is to choose a year-old lamb, one without spot or blemish, the best in all the flock. God told them, kill that lamb and drain its blood into a basin. Then roast the lamb. But before you eat, take a bunch of hyssop and dip it into the blood in the basin, and put some of the blood on top of both sides of the door frame. And on that same night I will pass through Egypt, and I will strike down every firstborn, both men and animals, and I will bring judgment on the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. So someone in every home took hyssop and dipped it in the blood and put it on the door frame. And that night, just as God had told them, he brought judgment upon Egypt. And there was weeping and wailing in the homes of the Egyptians. But wherever God saw the blood of the lamb on the door, those homes were spared. The next morning, Exodus 12 tells us, the Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country, and after 400 years of bondage, they were free. And God said, this is a day you are to commemorate for the generations to come. You shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord, a lasting ordinance. Those of Jewish faith still celebrate Passover, and it's an important part of the Bible that we as Christians never forget too. God created a memorial day for us to worship also. It all started in the beginning when God created the heavens and the earth. God worked 6 days in creation, and on the seventh day he did what? He rested, right? He rested. The Bible tells us that God consecrated that day and called it the Sabbath. The Sabbath, a day for rest. In the 10 Commandments, God told the Jews that they were to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. So the Sabbath became a day of worship and rest, a day to remember the blessings that God gives us. Centuries passed, and the Jews began to distort the Sabbath day that God had set aside for rest and worship. In fact, it became so bad that Jesus said to the Pharisees, the Sabbath was made for man, not the man made for Sabbath. And that reminds us that whenever we come together on Sunday as a church, we're to come to meet a holy and righteous God, to remember what God has done for us, and to rededicate ourselves to Him each Sunday in remembrance. And finally, in the Bible, there's a meal of memory. It was the night before the crucifixion, and Jesus met with his disciples together in that upper room to celebrate the Passover. It was to be an evening of remembering, as God had commanded long ago. But as they ate, Jesus gave them something new, something greater to remember. For Jesus took the bread, and after he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And in the same way, after the supper was over, he took the cup, gave thanks to God, and said, "This is my blood of the new covenant, poured out for you and for many. Do this in remembrance of me." You see, no longer was this meal just a Passover meal. It wasn't simply a reminder of the bondage that the Egyptians inflicted upon the Jews. Now the bread and the cup were to be eternal reminders of Jesus, of his sacrifice and his love for us. And that's why Jesus said, "Do this in remembrance of me." We don't take communion because we are worthy. We take communion because God is holy. And God invites us into his presence to be a part of his supper. And we get to share that with him and others. We have much to remember. Whatever you do, don't forget how you got here. Don't forget the price that has been paid so that we can have freedom and enjoy the blessings that God has given us. A few years ago, there was a young and successful executive named Josh who was traveling down a Chicago neighborhood road. He was going a bit too fast in his new car, this one right here, the one that he had bought at an auction, and he had paid way too much money for this classic 1969 red convertible Jaguar XKE, totally restored. It was a nice ride. And he was careful with this car, and so he was watching carefully for animals who might be darting out into the road between parked cars. And he slowed down for a minute when he thought he saw something. As his car passed that spot, nothing darted out, so he started to keep going again, but all of a sudden, whoop! This brick hit the side of his new car, his shiny new Jag, and he was mad. He screeched his brakes, and he backed up, and he got out of the car, and he jumped out, and he grabbed this kid, and he said, "What are you doing?" He was building up this big head of steam that he had on him. He said, "This is my new Jag, and this brick that you threw is going to cost you a lot of money. Why'd you throw it?" And the little boy said, Please, mister, I'm sorry. I didn't know what else to do. I threw the brick because no one would stop and help. It's my brother. He's over here, and he was in a wheelchair, and he fell off the curb and fell into the street. And I don't know what to do. Would you please help me get him back into his wheelchair and on the sidewalk before something happens to him? Well, the young executive swallowed the big lump in his throat, and he went over and he helped this boy's brother back into the wheelchair and onto the sidewalk. And he made sure they got back home. It was a long walk back to this executive's sleek, red, shiny, 12-cylinder Jaguar XKE. A long and slow walk. Josh never did fix that side door. He kept the dent to remind him not to go so fast in life. Not to go so fast that someone would have to get his attention with a brick. This Memorial Day, we too pause. We pause from our busy lives. We slow down and remember those brave men and women who fought for our liberty as Americans. And we remember why we are Christian. Those biblical stories of Christian people. We remember and are thankful. Amen.